Somewhere beneath the waves, there may be a city. A city of stone, of streets, of people who once lived, built, loved, and died. A civilization so advanced for its time that when it vanished, it left nothing behind but a single name, whispered across centuries, debated by scholars, dismissed by scientists, and yet never forgotten. Atlantis. The word alone carries weight. It conjures images of grand temples sinking beneath a dark ocean, of a powerful empire swallowed whole in the sea in a single catastrophic night. Most people have heard the name. Far fewer have asked the serious question behind it. What if it was real? As an actual historical civilization, one that existed, flourished, and was destroyed before written history began to record the world around us. That is the question this documentary sets out to answer. By following evidence, by examining what the ancient sources actually said, what geology and archaeology can confirm or deny, and what the most serious researchers in the world have concluded after decades of investigation. Because the story of Atlantis does not begin in the ocean, it begins with a philosopher, a dialogue, and a claim so specific, so detailed, and so precise that it has never been fully explained away. It begins with Plato. To understand Atlantis, you have to go back to the source. You have to go back to the man who first put the story into writing, a man whose credibility, whose intellectual legacy, and whose place in the history of human thought makes him one of the last people you would expect to simply invent a fairy tale. His name was Plato, and in 360 BC, he wrote something that the world has never been able to forget. Plato was one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, a student of Socrates, a teacher of Aristotle, the founder of the Academy in Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. His works shaped the foundations of Western philosophy, mathematics, science, and political theory. When Plato wrote something, the ancient world paid attention, and the modern world still does. In 360 BC, Plato wrote two dialogues, philosophical texts in the form of conversations between historical and fictional characters. The first was called Timaeus, the second was called Critias, and in both of these texts, Plato introduced for the first and only time in ancient literature the story of Atlantis. The account is surprisingly precise. Atlantis was a naval empire of extraordinary power, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we today call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. The civilization was said to be older than Athens itself, founded approximately 9,000 years before Plato's own time, placing its origins around 9600 BC. Plato described the city in remarkable detail. It was built on concentric rings of land and water, alternating circles of earth and sea surrounding a central island. At the heart of the city stood a great temple dedicated to Poseidon, the god of the sea, who had fathered the first kings of Atlantis. The city had ports, canals, bridges, walls covered in precious metals, and a population of enormous size. Its military power was vast enough to have threatened both Europe and Asia simultaneously. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophic violence, earthquakes, floods, fire from the sky, it was gone, swallowed by the ocean, vanished without a trace. There are two ways to read this account. The first is to treat it as pure allegory. Plato was known for using fictional settings to make philosophical arguments. The Republic, his most famous work, describes an ideal city that never existed. Perhaps Atlantis was simply a literary device, a powerful empire created to illustrate the dangers of moral corruption and imperial overreach. Many serious scholars hold this view, and they are right to take it seriously. But the level of detail Plato provides is not typical of his allegorical writing. When Plato invented cities for philosophical purposes, he did not give them geographic coordinates. He did not describe their architecture in precise measurements. He did not specify the exact number of years since their destruction, or the specific metals used in the construction of their walls, or the dimensions of the canals that divided their districts. In Timaeus and Critias, he does all of these things. He writes that the outer walls of Atlantis were covered in brass, the inner walls in tin, and the walls of the citadel itself, the innermost ring at the heart of the city, were covered in a mysterious metal he calls auric halcum, described as second in value only to gold, and which gleamed like fire across the entire city. He gives the dimensions of the central plain, 3,000 stadia long and 2,000 stadia wide, a stadia being an ancient Greek unit equivalent to roughly 185 meters. He describes the irrigation system, the harbors, the number of ships, the military obligations of each district, the political structure of the 10 kings who ruled the island under a covenant with Poseidon. This is the language of a historian attempting to reconstruct something real. And Plato himself, through the voice of his characters, insists on the historical nature of the account. In Timaeus, the story is introduced as something passed down through generations of an Athenian family, originally told to the statesman Solon during his travels in Egypt by Egyptian priests who claimed to have records going back thousands of years. The priests even chided the Greeks for having short historical memories, telling Solon that the Greeks were like children compared to the Egyptians, who had kept records of civilizations and catastrophes that the Greeks had long forgotten. Plato is presenting Atlantis as something told to Solon, recorded, and passed down. Whether that chain of transmission is historically accurate is a separate question, but the intention of the text is clearly that of a writer signaling history, not fiction. So we are left with a genuine puzzle, a philosopher of extraordinary intellectual rigor, writing with an unusual and specific detail about a civilization that no other ancient source confirms, in a location that no expedition has ever found, describing events that no geological record has yet verified. Was it allegory? Was it history? Was it something in between, a kernel of real memory, elaborated and mythologized over centuries before it reached Plato's pen? These are the questions that have driven researchers, archaeologists, geologists, and historians for more than 2,000 years. When Plato wrote about Atlantis in 360 BC, the story landed in a world already full of competing ideas about the past, about myth, about history, and the relationship between the two. The ancient Greeks were not naive. They questioned everything, including each other. And the reaction to Plato's account was, from the very beginning, divided. Some of Plato's contemporaries took the story seriously. His own student, Crantor of Soli, reportedly traveled to Egypt shortly after Plato's death, specifically to verify the claim that Egyptian priests held records of Atlantis. According to ancient sources, Crantor came back convinced. Several other ancient writers, including the historian Diodorus Siculus and the geographer Strabo, referenced the story with varying degrees of seriousness. Strabo notably observed that the story might well be based on real events, even if Plato had shaped and embellished it for philosophical purposes. Skepticism came just as quickly. Aristotle, perhaps the most brilliant of all Plato's students, reportedly dismissed the story entirely. His reasoning was blunt. Plato had invented Atlantis to make a philosophical point, and once that point was made, he had simply let the island sink, just as a writer disposes of a setting that is no longer needed. For Aristotle, the very completeness of the destruction was suspicious. Real historical catastrophes leave traces. Real civilizations leave ruins, descendants, cultural echoes. Atlantis left nothing, and that was the fingerprint of invention, not of history. This early division, believers on one side, skeptics on the other, mirrors the debate that continues today. Neither side has ever fully won the argument. The skeptics have logic and the absence of physical evidence on their side. The believers have the stubborn, unexplained specificity of Plato's text on theirs. Through the centuries that followed, the story survived every attempt to bury it. Roman writers referenced it. Medieval scholars puzzled over it, sometimes incorporating Atlantis into their theological frameworks, trying to reconcile it with biblical accounts of the flood. Renaissance explorers, crossing the Atlantic and reaching the Americas in the late 15th century, immediately wondered if they had found the remnants of the lost continent. The indigenous civilizations of the New World, with their pyramids, their sophisticated calendars, their complex social structures, seemed almost too advanced to have developed in isolation. Atlantis offered a convenient explanation. The name appeared in the works of Francis Bacon, who in 1627 wrote a utopian novel called New Atlantis, imagining an advanced civilization on a remote island in the Pacific. It appeared in the theories of early geographers, trying to make sense of why the coastlines of Africa and South America seemed to mirror each other, a question that would not be properly answered until the theory of plate tectonics in the 20th century. And it appeared, most powerfully, in the work of a 19th-century American politician and writer named Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was a sensation. Donnelly argued that Atlantis had been a real continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the mother civilization of all human cultures on both sides of the ocean, the source of the pyramids in Egypt and in Mexico, the origin of the flood myths found in dozens of unconnected cultures around the world. The book went through dozens of editions and was read by hundreds of thousands of people. It transformed what had been a scholarly debate into a mass cultural phenomenon. Donnelly's specific claims have been thoroughly discredited by modern geology and archaeology, but his broader impact, the popularization of Atlantis as a mystery that science had not yet solved, proved extraordinarily durable. Because the question at the heart of the Atlantis story is not really about a sunken island. It is about the limits of human memory, about what happened in the deep past before writing began, about whether civilizations can rise, flourish, and disappear so completely that they leave almost no trace at all. If you take Plato at his word, the location of the lost city is not a mystery. Plato tells you exactly where it is, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, a large island, bigger than Libya and Asia combined, sitting in the open sea to the west of the known world. For centuries, this was the dominant interpretation. Atlantis was in the Atlantic. The ocean is even named after it, or so the ancient tradition suggests. The Atlantic is vast, deep, and in the ancient world almost entirely unknown. If a civilization had existed somewhere in those waters and had been destroyed, who would have known? The Atlantic hypothesis gained its most powerful modern articulation in the work of Ignatius Donnelly, who pointed to a specific geological feature, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is one of the most dramatic geological structures on the planet. It is an underwater mountain range running almost the entire length of the Atlantic Ocean, stretching for over 16,000 kilometers. In several places, the ridge rises above sea level, forming islands: the Azores, Iceland, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands. Donnelly argued that these islands were the last remaining peaks of the sunken continent of Atlantis, remnants of a landmass that had once stood above the ocean before a catastrophic geological event drove it beneath the waves. It was a compelling visual argument, but modern geology tells a very different story. The theory of plate tectonics gives us a complete and well-evidenced account of how the Atlantic Ocean formed. The Atlantic did not swallow a continent. It was created by two continents pulling apart. Approximately 180 million years ago, the supercontinent of Pangaea began to break apart. The landmasses that would become North America, South America, Europe, and Africa slowly separated, and the Atlantic Ocean formed in the gap between them. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is the seam where two tectonic plates are pulling away from each other, where new oceanic crust is constantly being generated by volcanic activity deep beneath the sea floor. Continents, in the geological sense, do not sink. They are made of lighter rock than the oceanic crust, which means they float rather than submerge. A continent-sized landmass sinking beneath the waves in a single catastrophic event is not something plate tectonics permits. This is a question of the fundamental physics of how the Earth's crust behaves. This is the most decisive blow to the literal Atlantic hypothesis, and it is one from which the theory has never recovered in mainstream scientific circles. But the Atlantic hypothesis is not entirely dead among serious researchers, because the question of a sunken continent is not the same as the question of a sunken island. At the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago, remarkably close to the date Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis, global sea levels rose dramatically. The melting of massive ice sheets caused sea levels to rise by somewhere between 100 and 120 meters worldwide. In certain regions, this was catastrophic. Large areas of coastline inhabited during the Ice Age were permanently submerged. The North Sea was once a vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, a region researchers have named Daughterland, and it was flooded as sea levels rose. Similar flooding occurred in the Persian Gulf, in Southeast Asia, and along coastlines all over the world. Could something similar have happened in the Atlantic? Could there have been a significant landmass, not a continent, but a large island or coastal region submerged at the end of the last ice age, whose memory survived in oral tradition long enough to eventually reach Egyptian priests, and through them, Solon and Plato? This is a more cautious and scientifically defensible version of the Atlantic hypothesis. It requires only that a real place was flooded by rising sea levels, that the memory of that flooding was preserved across thousands of years of oral tradition, and that the story was eventually recorded and perhaps elaborated by Plato. The Azores have attracted particular attention. These Portugal islands, sitting in the middle of the Atlantic, roughly 1,500 kilometers west of the Iberian Peninsula, rise from the mid-Atlantic ridge and are surrounded by relatively shallow underwater plateaus. The underwater plateau known as the Ampere Seamount, located to the southwest of Portugal, has also been the subject of speculation. Soviet oceanographic expeditions in the 1970s reported what some interpreted as possible evidence of man-made structures on the seafloor, though subsequent investigation failed to confirm these findings. The Atlantic hypothesis in its literal form is geologically impossible, but in its more modest form, the idea that rising sea levels may have submerged a real place whose memory eventually found its way into Plato's account, it cannot be entirely dismissed. While the Atlantic hypothesis captures the imagination, it is in the Mediterranean that the most scientifically credible candidates for Atlantis are found. Of all the theories proposed over the past 2 centuries, 2 stand above the rest: the island of Santorini and the Minoan civilization of Crete. These 2 theories are closely linked. They are really 2 aspects of the same argument, and when examined together, the parallels with Plato's account become difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Let us begin with Santorini. Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera, is a small Greek island in the southern Aegean Sea, roughly 200 kilometers southeast of mainland Greece. Today, it is one of the most photographed places in the world, famous for its whitewashed buildings and dramatic cliffs rising above a deep circular bay. But that bay is a caldera, the collapsed remnant of a volcanic crater, and the volcano that created it produced one of the most powerful eruptions in the history of human civilization. Sometime around 1600 BC, the volcano at the center of Thera erupted with catastrophic force. The eruption has been estimated at between 4 and 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, making it one of the largest volcanic events of the past 10,000 years. For comparison, the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, which killed tens of thousands and was heard nearly 5,000 kilometers away, was a smaller event. The Thera eruption triggered secondary catastrophes. The collapse of the volcanic cone generated massive tsunamis spreading across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. The ash layer from the eruption has been found in ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, in sediment layers across the eastern Mediterranean, and in archaeological sites from Egypt to Turkey. Archaeological excavations at Akrotiri, on the southern tip of Santorini have revealed a remarkably well-preserved Bronze Age town buried beneath meters of volcanic ash, a Mediterranean Pompeii. The town shows sophisticated urban planning, multi-story buildings, advanced drainage systems, and a rich artistic culture expressed in vivid frescoes that have survived to this day. The people of Akrotiri were part of a prosperous, culturally advanced civilization. That civilization was the Minoan. The Minoan civilization, centered on Crete roughly 100 kilometers south of Santorini, was the first advanced civilization in Europe. At its peak, between approximately 2000 and 1450 BC, the Minoans were the dominant power of the Aegean world. They built elaborate palace complexes, the most famous at Knossos, covering approximately 20,000 square meters with hundreds of rooms, sophisticated plumbing, and elaborate painted decorations. They developed a writing system known as Linear A, which has never been fully deciphered. They maintained extensive trade networks connecting Crete to Egypt, the Levant, mainland Greece, and Anatolia. When researchers began comparing the Minoan civilization with Plato's description of Atlantis in the 20th century, the parallels were striking enough to generate serious academic attention. Plato describes Atlantis as a naval power that dominated the seas and controlled trade across a wide region. The Minoans were exactly that. Plato describes elaborate palace complexes and advanced infrastructure. The Minoans match this precisely. Plato mentions auricomcum, a mysterious reddish metal. Minoan art and artifacts show extensive use of copper, which is reddish in color. Some researchers have suggested aurichalcum may have been a reference to a copper alloy or to the reddish volcanic rock abundant in the Aegean. Around 1450 BC, the Minoan civilization collapsed, suddenly and dramatically. The palace at Knossos was destroyed. Other Minoan centers show evidence of fire and abandonment. Within a generation, the Minoans as an independent civilization had ceased to exist, replaced by Mycenaean Greeks who adapted Minoan writing into their own script, known as Linear B. The exact cause of this collapse is not fully understood. The Theran eruption, with its tsunamis, ash clouds, and disruption of agriculture and trade, is one of the primary candidates. Whether the eruption was the direct cause, a contributing factor, or largely coincidental remains a subject of active research. But the sequence, a powerful island civilization, a catastrophic volcanic and seismic event, a rapid collapse, maps onto Plato's account with enough precision to demand serious consideration. There is, however, one significant problem with the Minoan-Santorini theory. The dates do not match. Plato places the destruction of Atlantis approximately 9,000 years before his own time, around 9600 BC. The Theran eruption occurred around 1600 BC. The Minoan collapse around 1450 BC. These events are roughly 900 years before Plato, not 9,000. The discrepancy is a factor of 10. Some researchers propose this can be explained by a translation error. When the story passed from Egyptian records into Greek, the Egyptian symbol for 100 may have been misread as 1,000. If you divide Plato's 9,000 years by 10, you get 900 years squarely in the time frame of the Theran eruption. It is an elegant solution, but unavoidably a hypothesis built on an assumed error in a document that no longer exists. Despite this unresolved chronological problem, the Minoan-Santorini theory remains the most academically credible of all the Atlantis hypotheses. It is the only theory that points to a real advanced civilization, a real catastrophic event, and a real collapse in a geographic region known to the Egyptians, fitting broadly within the narrative framework of Plato's account. Every great mystery attracts serious researchers, and it attracts something else entirely, the full spectrum of human imagination, unconstrained by evidence, unbothered by contradiction. Atlantis has inspired more fringe theories than almost any other subject in alternative history, They are worth examining, not because they're credible, but because understanding why they fail tells us something important about what a real answer to the Atlantis question would need to look like. Let us begin with Antarctica. The Antarctic hypothesis draws on a map. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map that has fascinated researchers and conspiracy theorists alike for over a century. The Piri Reis Map shows what appears, to some observers, to be a coastline resembling Antarctica, a continent not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after the map was drawn. Some argue the map preserves knowledge from an earlier unknown civilization that had explored Antarctica before the ice covered it, and that this civilization was Atlantis. The problems are numerous. The resemblance between the bottom edge of the Piri Reis Map and the Antarctic coastline is far less precise than its proponents claim. The map contains significant distortions throughout, and the southern landmass it depicts is more plausibly interpreted as a speculative representation of Terra Australis Incognita, the hypothetical southern continent that European geographers had been imagining since antiquity. Furthermore, geological evidence shows that Antarctica has been covered by its ice sheet for approximately 34 million years, with no ice-free periods within the time frame of human civilization. The Caribbean and the Bahamas have also attracted considerable speculation, largely due to an underwater discovery made in 1968 near the island of North Bimini. Divers found what appeared to be a road made of large, flat, rectangular limestone blocks arranged in a remarkably regular pattern. This became known as the Bimini Road, generating enormous excitement, particularly because it had been predicted years earlier by the American psychic Edgar Cayce, who claimed in trance readings in the 1930s and 1940s that evidence of Atlantis would be found near Bimini around 1968 or 1969. Subsequent geological analysis was thorough and consistent. The limestone blocks are a natural geological formation known as beach rock, sedimentary rock formed when carbonate sediments are cemented together in the intertidal zone. The regularity of the blocks is produced by natural fracturing patterns in the limestone. Multiple independent geological studies have reached the same conclusion. The Bimini Road is not a road, it is not man-made, and it is not evidence of Atlantis. The Azores have generated their own fringe claims. In 2013, significant media attention was generated by reports of an underwater pyramid near the island of São Miguel, claimed by some to be larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Subsequent investigation by Portuguese naval authorities and independent geologists identified it as a natural underwater geological formation, a seamount shaped by volcanic activity and erosion. Then there is the theory placing Atlantis in what is now the Sahara Desert, a geological formation in Mauritania known as the Richat structure, or the Eye of Africa. From satellite imagery, the Richat structure is visually spectacular, a series of concentric rings of rock, roughly 50 kilometers in diameter, sitting in the middle of the Western Sahara. The resemblance to Plato's description of concentric rings is immediate and striking, and the theory has gained significant traction on social media and YouTube in recent years. The geological reality is less exciting. The Richat structure is a deeply eroded geological dome, a formation created over hundreds of millions of years by the uplift and erosion of sedimentary and igneous rock layers. It contains no evidence of human construction. And while it sits at roughly the same latitude as the Strait of Gibraltar, the claim that it matches Plato's description requires ignoring virtually every specific detail Plato provides, including the fact that Plato explicitly places Atlantis in the ocean, not in the middle of a desert. What all of these theories share is a common methodological problem. They begin with a conclusion, Atlantis was here, and then selectively gather details that appear to support it, while ignoring everything that does not. A genuine investigation must be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, including to the conclusion that the story has no historical basis at all. Their popularity reflects something fundamental in human nature, the deep and persistent desire to believe that the world contains hidden wonders, that beneath the surface of what we know, there are secrets waiting to be discovered, that the experts have missed something. This desire is not foolish. It drove Heinrich Schliemann to dig at Hisarlik in Turkey and find the actual ruins of Troy, when most scholars believed Troy was pure myth. It drove Arthur Evans to excavate at Knossos and reveal the Minoan civilization to the modern world. But the discipline that separates these triumphs from failures is evidence, methodology, and the willingness to accept that a compelling visual resemblance does not constitute proof of anything. The fringe theories about Atlantis tell us a great deal about human nature. They tell us very little about Atlantis. It is time to ask what science itself, hard empirical science, actually has to say about the possibility of a lost civilization beneath the ocean. The answer is more nuanced than either the true believers or the outright skeptics tend to acknowledge. The most fundamental question: can a large landmass sink beneath the ocean rapidly within a human lifetime or a single catastrophic event? As established when examining the Atlantic hypothesis, the geological mechanism Plato seems to describe, a continent-sized landmass sinking vertically into the ocean floor, is not something plate tectonics permits. The physics of crustal density make it impossible for a continental landmass to subside into the oceanic crust beneath it. This is as well established as any fact in the earth sciences. But the sinking of a continent is not the only mechanism by which a civilization could disappear beneath the sea. The end of the last ice age, occurring between approximately 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, was one of the most transformative periods in human history. The great ice sheets melted and the water went into the oceans. Global sea levels rose by an estimated 100 to 120 meters over several thousand years, a rise that included periods of dramatically accelerated flooding driven by the collapse of major ice dams and the rapid discharge of enormous glacial lakes. The consequences for coastal populations were profound. Enormous areas of what are now continental shelves were once dry land. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf, a vast area of shallow seafloor connecting the islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo to mainland Southeast Asia, was once a landmass roughly the size of India, supporting large human populations. It was entirely submerged. In the North Sea, Doggerland, the land bridge between Britain and continental Europe, was similarly flooded, its forests and human settlements disappearing beneath the waves. These are not hypothetical events. They are documented by physical evidence. Fishermen, trawling the floor of the North Sea, have brought up the bones of mammoths, the antlers of deer, and the tools of Mesolithic hunters, the physical remnants of a world that existed before the flooding. Underwater archaeological surveys have found evidence of human habitation on submerged continental shelves in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea region, and off the coasts of India and Australia. The flooding of the Black Sea has attracted particular attention. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, in a 1997 study, proposed that the Black Sea had undergone a catastrophic flood approximately 7,500 years ago. At the end of the Ice Age, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean by a land barrier at what is now the Bosporus Strait. As Mediterranean sea levels rose, water eventually breached this barrier and poured into the Black Sea basin in a massive flood, rapidly raising its water level and inundating thousands of square kilometers of previously inhabited coastline. Ryan and Pittman proposed this event was the historical basis for flood myths in multiple cultures of the region, including the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh and, by extension, the biblical story of Noah's flood. What all of this tells us is that the broad strokes of Plato's narrative, a civilization destroyed by catastrophic floods and geological upheaval, are not scientifically implausible. They describe, in mythologized form, exactly the kinds of events that occurred at the end of the last ice age. The specific claim that a civilization was swallowed by the sea is a description of something that happened repeatedly to real communities in the millennia before written history began. The question is not whether such things happened, we know they did. The question is whether Plato's account refers to a specific identifiable event, and whether the civilization he describes left any physical trace that modern science can find. Deep-sea exploration technology has improved dramatically since the mid-20th century. Remotely operated vehicles, multi-beam sonar mapping, and sediment coring now allow researchers to examine the seafloor in extraordinary detail. The Mediterranean seafloor has yielded remarkable discoveries: submerged Bronze Age harbors, ancient shipwrecks, evidence of prehistoric coastal settlements. But it has not yielded anything resembling the remains of an advanced civilization of the scale Plato describes. This does not prove that no such civilization existed. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the seafloor remains incompletely explored. But after decades of increasingly sophisticated underwater investigation, the physical evidence for Atlantis remains exactly what it was in Plato's time: non-existent. Geology and oceanography tell us what the physical world looked like in the distant past, but to evaluate Plato's account seriously, we need to ask a different question. What do we actually know about the level of human civilization that existed in 9600 BC? Was an advanced, sophisticated maritime empire even possible at that time? This is where archaeology becomes indispensable. Let us be precise. Plato places the destruction of Atlantis at roughly 9600 BC, at the very end of the last ice age, in the period archaeologists call the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, a period just before the agricultural revolution, just before the first permanent settlements, and thousands of years before the earliest known writing systems, monumental architecture, or complex urban societies. The conventional understanding of this period is straightforward. Human beings in 9600 BC were, for the most part, hunter-gatherers. They lived in small, mobile communities, used stone tools, had no cities, no writing, no large-scale agriculture, and no metallurgy. The first recognizable urban civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt did not emerge until approximately 3500 to 3000 BC, roughly 6,000 years after the date Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. If we take Plato's chronology literally, he is describing a civilization 6,000 years ahead of its time. The gap is enormous. It is the single greatest obstacle to taking his account at face value. But the archaeological picture of this period has become significantly more complicated in recent decades. One discovery in particular has forced archaeologists to reconsider their most basic assumptions about the timeline of human civilization. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey noticed something unusual protruding from the ground on a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish. Excavations led by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revealed a complex of massive stone enclosures filled with elaborately carved T-shaped limestone pillars, some up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars were decorated with sophisticated relief carvings of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, vultures, executed with skill and artistry entirely unexpected for the period. Radiocarbon dating stunned the archaeological community. Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, around 9,600 to 10,000 BC. It predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. And it was built by people who, according to the conventional archaeological model, should not have had the social organization, the labor coordination, or the technical skill to construct anything remotely like it. A maritime empire leaves a particular archaeological signature: harbor installations, shipwrecks, trade goods distributed across wide geographic areas, cultural influences transmitted along sea routes. The Minoan archaeological record shows precisely this pattern. If an earlier maritime civilization had existed in the Atlantic or the Western Mediterranean, we would expect similar evidence. The fact that we have not found it is significant, though not conclusive, given the degree to which rising sea levels have obscured the coastal archaeology of the relevant period. Now, the harder question. If Atlantis was real and was destroyed suddenly and catastrophically, what would that destruction have meant for the human world around it? If it was, as Plato suggests, a dominant maritime power controlling trade across a wide region, its sudden disappearance would have been an economic, technological, and cultural catastrophe for every society connected to it. Trade networks would have collapsed. Technologies dependent on the exchange of raw materials, metals in particular, would have been disrupted or lost. Knowledge and skills concentrated in the urban centers of Atlantis would have died with those centers. This kind of civilizational collapse is not hypothetical. We have a well-documented example in the Late Bronze Age collapse, occurring around 1200 BC, which destroyed or severely disrupted virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Ugaritic civilization of the Levant, the Egyptian New Kingdom. The interconnectedness of these civilizations, which had been a source of strength during growth, became a catastrophic vulnerability when the system was stressed beyond its capacity to recover. The collapse set back technological and social development in the region by centuries. A similar collapse at the end of the last ice age, in a world perhaps more interconnected than we currently believe, could have had exactly the civilization resetting effect the Atlantis myth implies. It could have reduced surviving populations to subsistence-level existence, erased the accumulated knowledge of generations, and created the conditions for the slow, apparently independent reemergence of complex civilization that we see beginning in Mesopotamia and Egypt several thousand years later. This is informed speculation, grounded in what we know about how civilizational collapse works. We do not have the evidence to confirm it. We may never have the evidence to confirm it. What we do have is the myth itself, a story of a great civilization destroyed at the height of its power, its achievements lost, its memory preserved only as a warning. And whether that story is history, allegory, or something in between, it contains a truth that transcends the question of its literal accuracy. Civilizations are fragile. They depend on the continuity of knowledge, the stability of environment, and the maintenance of the social bonds that hold complex societies together. When those conditions fail, whether through natural catastrophe, internal corruption, or the simple passage of time, even the greatest achievements of human ingenuity can disappear as completely as if they had sunk beneath the sea. That is the lesson of Atlantis. And it is a lesson that does not require the city to have been real. We have traveled a long way. We have followed Plato's account back to its origins, examined the most credible geographical candidates, confronted the limits of what geology and archaeology can tell us, and imagined what the existence of Atlantis would actually mean for our understanding of human history. The honest conclusion is that we do not know whether Atlantis was real. But there is one final question this investigation demands we ask, and it may be the most revealing question of all. Why does Atlantis endure? In a deeper sense, why does this particular story, of all the thousands of myths and legends the ancient world produced, continue to grip the human imagination with such extraordinary force 2,500 years after it was first written down? Why does it generate books, films, documentaries, YouTube videos, academic papers, and heated arguments between strangers on the internet, year after year, with no sign of losing its power? The answer lies not in the ocean, it lies in us. Human beings, across every culture and every period of history, have shown a consistent tendency to imagine a golden age in the past, a time when life was better, people were wiser, and the world was more just and more beautiful than it is today. The ancient Greeks had their Age of Gold, a mythical era of peace and abundance preceding the corrupt world of their own time. The Hindus have the concept of the Satya Yuga, a primordial age of truth and perfection from which humanity has been descending ever since. The Abrahamic religions have the Garden of Eden, a paradise lost through human failing, remembered as a wound at the center of human experience. Indigenous cultures on every continent have their own versions of a primordial world that was whole and good before it was broken. Atlantis fits perfectly into this universal pattern. It is the Golden Age story dressed in the language of history and geography. It is the dream of a world better than ours, made concrete and specific by Plato's remarkably detailed account and made tragic by its destruction. It offers everything the Golden Age myth requires: greatness, beauty, moral failure, catastrophe, and loss. And it adds something that most Golden Age myths do not have: the tantalizing possibility that it might actually be true, that somewhere beneath the waves, the ruins of that lost world are waiting to be found. This possibility is what separates Atlantis from purely mythological lost paradises. You cannot go looking for the Garden of Eden with sonar equipment. You cannot send a remotely operated vehicle to search for the Age of Gold. But you can, at least in principle, search the ocean floor for Atlantis. The story is specific enough, geographical enough, and historical enough in its framing to sustain the hope of physical discovery. And that hope has never died, because the ocean has never been fully explored and the possibility has never been definitively closed. There is also a deeper psychological function the Atlantis myth serves, one that becomes more rather than less relevant as human civilization grows more complex and more powerful. Atlantis is a story about the limits of human achievement. It says explicitly that greatness is not permanent, that power corrupts, that civilizations which forget their moral foundations will be destroyed by forces greater than themselves. In Plato's account, the downfall of Atlantis was not simply geological, it was moral. The Atlanteans, originally noble and virtuous because of their divine ancestry, gradually became corrupted by wealth and power. They became greedy, aggressive, and morally degraded. And it was this moral corruption that prompted the gods to destroy them. This moral dimension was the entire point for Plato. He was writing at a time when Athens itself had recently suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War, a conflict many Athenians interpreted as a consequence of their own imperial overreach and moral corruption. The story of Atlantis, a great maritime empire destroyed by its own hubris, was a mirror held up to Athens, and by extension to any civilization that allowed power and wealth to corrupt its foundational values. That warning has lost none of its relevance. If anything, it has gained resonance. We live in a world of extraordinary technological power, of civilizational reach and complexity that would have seemed impossible to any previous generation. We also live in a world of accelerating environmental degradation, widening inequality, and political systems straining under pressures they were not designed to accommodate. The story of a great civilization that destroyed itself through a combination of natural catastrophe and moral failure speaks to our moment with uncomfortable directness. Göbekli Tepe does not prove the existence of Atlantis. It does not demonstrate that an advanced civilization existed in 1900 BC. What it does demonstrate is something almost equally significant: that our understanding of the capabilities of human societies at the end of the last ice age was wrong, and that the conventional timeline of complex human behavior needs to be revised. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required the coordination of large numbers of workers over an extended period. It required specialists with high-level stone carving skills. It required a social structure capable of organizing and directing collective labor on a significant scale. So, was Atlantis real? After everything we have examined, the ancient sources, the geology, the archaeology, the geography, the science, the honest answer is that we do not know, and we may never know. What we do know is this: the world at the end of the last ice age was more complex, more populated, and more capable than we once assumed. Coastlines that are now beneath the sea were once home to human communities whose histories are largely lost to us. Catastrophic floods, volcanic eruptions, and geological upheavals did destroy settlements, disrupt civilizations, and leave behind traumatic memories that survived in oral tradition for thousands of years before anyone wrote them down. Whether one of those lost worlds was the specific civilization that Plato called Atlantis, whether his account preserves, however distorted by time and transmission, a genuine memory of a real place and a real catastrophe, remains an open question. One that geology has not closed, one that archaeology has not closed, one that the unexplored depths of the ocean have not closed. But perhaps the most important thing Atlantis offers us is not an answer. It is a reminder that human civilization is not the permanent, inevitable condition of the world. It is a fragile, improbable achievement built on foundations that can be shaken. And the ocean, patient, vast, and indifferent, is always there, waiting at the edges of everything we build. The story of Atlantis began with a philosopher asking what makes a civilization worthy of survival. 2,500 years later, that question is still waiting for an answer.